My name is Laura Brennan, and for the past 12 years, I have worked as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Our facility sits just 15 minutes from Camp Lejeune, one of the largest Marine Corps bases on the East Coast. Over the years, I have treated countless service members, learning to navigate the unique challenges that come with military medicine. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened on a cold February night that changed everything I thought I knew about my profession, about institutional power, and about the price of doing what is right. That night, a patient came through our doors carrying secrets that powerful people wanted buried. He could not speak freely, but he found a way to communicate, and I was the only one who understood. What followed was a descent into a world of lies, cover-ups, and moral dilemmas that tested every value I hold dear. This is the story of how a single silent gesture unraveled a conspiracy, and how I became the one person standing between a Marine and the forces determined to silence him forever. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher. Medicine was never the obvious path for someone from my background, but I was drawn to it from a young age. I remember volunteering at our local hospital during high school, watching nurses move through the chaos of the emergency room with a calm efficiency that seemed almost superhuman. After graduating from nursing school, I bounced around between different hospitals, trying to find where I fit. When the position at Mercy General opened up, I jumped at the chance. Jacksonville was different from anything I had known, a military town where the rhythms of deployment and homecoming shaped everything. The hospital reflected that reality. We saw combat injuries, post-traumatic stress, the physical toll of military life. I learned quickly that military patients often carried burdens beyond their medical charts, unspoken traumas, classified information, orders that sometimes conflicted with their well-being. I became skilled at reading between the lines, understanding what patients could not or would not say. I learned the warning signs of someone struggling silently, the subtle cues that something deeper was wrong. That training, that instinct, would prove crucial on the night everything changed. If this story has already grabbed your attention, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. It was a Thursday night in February, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones despite being indoors. I was working the night shift in the post-operative recovery unit, a typically quiet assignment where patients rested after surgery. Around 11:30, I received word that a new patient was being transferred up from the surgical floor. The chart said routine appendectomy. A Marine Corps sergeant named Derek Hollis, 28 years old, stable vitals, expected standard recovery. When they wheeled him into the recovery bay, nothing about the situation seemed unusual at first glance. He was conscious, groggy from anesthesia, but responsive. Standard post-op appearance. But as I approached to do my initial assessment, something caught my attention. His eyes, they were wide, too alert for someone who should still be fighting off the effects of anesthesia. And there was something else in them, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Fear. Not the normal anxiety of being in a hospital, but something deeper, more primal. His hands gripped the bed rails with white-knuckled intensity. His breathing was measured, controlled, like someone fighting to appear calm. I introduced myself, began the routine checks, pulse, blood pressure, oxygen levels. Everything appeared normal on the monitors, but he never took his eyes off me. Not in a threatening way, but with an intensity that said he was trying to communicate something he could not voice aloud. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows you are feeling what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next changes everything. As I adjusted his IV line and checked the surgical dressing, Sergeant Hollis suddenly shifted his position. His movement seemed natural enough, a patient trying to get comfortable, but then I saw it. His left hand moved deliberately to his chest, fingers forming a specific configuration, thumb tucked, index and middle finger extended and crossed, ring and pinky finger folded down. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before he relaxed his hand again. My breath caught. I recognized that gesture from a training session I had attended 3 years earlier, a workshop on human trafficking awareness that included a segment on distress signals. The signal I had just witnessed was a military hand code, one used to indicate, "I need help," or "I am in danger," in situations where verbal communication was impossible or unsafe. My mind raced. Why would a Marine recovering from routine surgery need to signal for help? I glanced around the recovery unit. 2 other nurses were at the station, focused on their own patients. The halls were quiet. I looked back at Sergeant Hollis. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the question there. "Did you understand?" I gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible. His shoulders relaxed just a fraction, relief washing over his features. Then I noticed something else. The 2 men sitting in chairs outside his bay, dressed in civilian clothes, but with that unmistakable military bearing. They were watching. Not casually, but with focused attention. Watching him, watching me, watching everyone everyone who came near. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It is incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. And if you are feeling what I felt, hit that subscribe button, because this is only the beginning. I finished the initial assessment, keeping my expression neutral, and returned to the nurse's station to review Sergeant Hollis's chart more carefully. The medical history seemed straightforward. Acute appendicitis, emergency surgery performed by Dr. Raymond Kohler, one of our senior surgeons. Standard procedure, no complications noted. Expected discharge in 48 to 72 hours. But something nagged at me. I pulled up his admission records. He had come in through the emergency room around 6 that evening, presenting with severe abdominal pain, but the timestamp bothered me. Military personnel typically sought treatment at the base medical facilities first. Why had he come directly to a civilian hospital? I checked the referring physician line. Blank. No referral. Just a walk-in emergency case. I looked back toward his bay. The two men in civilian clothes had not moved. One was reading a magazine, the other staring at his phone, but their positions gave them clear sightlines to Sergeant Hollis. I approached my colleague, Maria, a nurse who had worked at Mercy General for nearly 20 years. I asked her casually if she had noticed anything unusual about the appendectomy patient. She shrugged, said everything seemed routine, said the surgery went smoothly, but then she added something that made my stomach drop. She mentioned that Dr. Kohler had specifically requested that only certain staff be involved in the case, and that representatives from the base had already been by twice to check on the patient's status. Over the next few hours, I watched and waited. Sergeant Hollis slept fitfully, his vitals stable but his body language speaking volumes. Every time footsteps approached, his muscles tensed. Every time one of the civilian-clothed men glanced his way, his breathing shifted. During my 3 a.m. rounds, I found a moment when both watchers had stepped away, one to the restroom, one to the vending machines. I moved quickly to Sergeant Hollis's bedside. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. I leaned in close, pretending to adjust his pillow, and whispered, "I saw your signal. I understand you need help, but I need to know what is happening." His eyes met mine, and in a voice barely above a breath, he said, "They are covering something up. The surgery was not for appendicitis. Check my records from the base. Check what happened 3 weeks ago during the training exercise at the range. They did something to us, and now they are making sure we do not talk." Before I could ask more, footsteps echoed in the hallway. I straightened up, resuming my professional demeanor. One of the watchers returned, his eyes moving from me to Sergeant Hollis with obvious suspicion. I finished my checks and moved away, my heart pounding. Back at the nurse's station, I accessed the medical database, searching for any records from Camp Lejeune linked to Sergeant Hollis. What I found, or rather did not find, was deeply troubling. There were gaps in his medical history, missing entries where there should have been routine checkups and post-deployment screenings. By morning, word had apparently spread that I was asking questions. I was called into the office of Helen Morrison, our head nurse and hospital administrator. She sat behind her desk with an expression that was equal parts concern and warning. She told me that I had been reassigned from post-operative recovery to the pediatric wing, effective immediately. When I asked why, she said it was simply a staffing need, but her eyes told a different story. She added, almost as an afterthought, that patient privacy was paramount, and that discussing cases with unauthorized personnel could result in termination. The message was clear: back off. But I could not. That night, I contacted a friend who worked in medical records at the base hospital. I asked her, carefully, if she could look into training exercises from 3 weeks prior, anything unusual, any unexplained illnesses or injuries among Marines who participated. She was hesitant, said she could get in serious trouble, but agreed to look quietly. 2 days later, she called me from a payphone, her voice shaking. She said she had found something, incident reports that had been classified, multiple Marines presenting with similar symptoms after a live fire exercise, respiratory issues, neurological symptoms, chemical exposure suspected, but all the reports had been sealed, and the affected personnel had been dispersed to different units. She told me to be careful, said that people who asked questions about this were being reassigned or pressured into silence. She said she could not help me anymore, that she had a family to think about. I spent the next week in a moral free fall. Every instinct told me to drop this, to protect my career, to trust that the system would handle whatever was happening. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sergeant Hollis's desperate signal, his silent plea for help. I thought about why I became a nurse in the first place, to help people, to be their advocate when they could not advocate for themselves. If I walked away now, what did that say about everything I claimed to believe? I started documenting everything secretly, taking photos of the inconsistencies in medical records, noting the names of people who had visited Sergeant Hollis, recording times and dates of suspicious conversations I overheard. I reached out to a journalist I knew from college, someone who specialized in military accountability issues. I told her I had information about a potential cover-up involving service members' health, but I needed her to help me understand what I was dealing with before I could go public. She agreed to meet me at a diner 2 towns over. When I showed her what I had gathered, her expression darkened. She said this looked like a pattern she had seen before, cases where service members were exposed to hazardous materials during training, and the military buried the incidents to avoid liability and bad publicity. She asked if I was prepared for what came next, for the pressure, the threats, the attempts to discredit me. I told her I did not know, but I could not live with myself if I stayed silent. The confrontation came faster than I expected. 1 week after I met with the journalist, I was called into a meeting with hospital administration, Dr. Kohler, and 2 men in suits who identified themselves as representatives from the Department of Defense. They laid out their case calmly, clinically. They said that Sergeant Hollis had indeed been part of a training exercise where accidental exposure to a chemical agent had occurred. They said the military was handling it, that affected personnel were receiving appropriate medical care, that the appendectomy had been genuine, but Sergeant Hollis was also being monitored for other issues. They said my inquiries were jeopardizing a sensitive investigation, potentially exposing classified information, putting national security at risk. They suggested strongly that I had misunderstood what I had seen, that my concern, while admirable, was misplaced. Then came the threats, veiled but unmistakable. They mentioned my nursing license, the complaints they could file, the difficulties I would face finding work anywhere if I was labeled as someone who violated patient confidentiality and interfered with military operations. Dr. Kohler sat silently through all of this, his expression unreadable. When they finished, I looked at each of them and said simply, if everything was being handled appropriately, Sergeant Hollis would not have needed to signal for help. If this was just about medical care, you would not be here threatening me. The room went silent. Then one of the men in suits leaned forward and said, "You are making a mistake that will ruin your life." I was suspended from Mercy General Hospital 3 days later, pending an investigation into allegations that I had violated patient privacy and acted unprofessionally. The journalist ran her story, and it exploded across military watchdog websites and social media. Within 48 hours, 2 other nurses from different hospitals near military bases came forward with similar stories. Marines and sailors who had shown signs of chemical exposure, records that had been altered or sealed, medical staff pressured into silence. A congressional inquiry was launched. The Department of Defense issued statements denying any wrongdoing, but promising a full investigation. Sergeant Hollis, along with 6 other service members from the same training exercise, came forward publicly with their stories. They described being exposed to an experimental riot control agent during what they were told was a routine drill, developing severe respiratory and neurological symptoms, being told their illnesses were unrelated or pre-existing conditions, being transferred to different bases to prevent them from comparing notes. The fallout was massive. Dr. Kohler resigned. Helen Morrison was fired. The 2 men who had been watching Sergeant Hollis were revealed to be private contractors hired by the military to monitor the affected personnel. But for me personally, the cost was devastating. I lost my job. I was blacklisted from every major hospital in the region. Colleagues I had worked with for years stopped returning my calls. I received threatening messages, had my car vandalized, found my personal information posted online by people calling me a traitor. 3 years have passed since that February night. The military settled with Sergeant Hollis and the other affected service members, admitting no wrongdoing but providing medical care and compensation. Reforms were implemented supposedly to prevent similar incidents. I eventually found work at a small community clinic in Virginia, far from Jacksonville, far from the life I had built. Some days I wonder if it was worth it, if one person's stand actually changed anything, or if the system simply absorbed the scandal and moved on. But then, I think about Sergeant Hollis, who reached out to me when he had no one else to turn to. I think about the other service members who found the courage to speak up because someone had listened. I think about the nurses who contacted me afterward, saying I had inspired them to advocate for their patients even when it was difficult. I think about the young nursing students who write to me, asking how to navigate ethical dilemmas in a profession where sometimes doing the right thing comes with tremendous personal cost. And I realize that the question is not whether my sacrifice was worth it. The question is, what kind of healthcare professional, what kind of person I want to be. I became a nurse to help people, to be their voice when they cannot speak for themselves. That night, a Marine gave me a signal, trusting that someone would see it and understand. I saw it, I understood, and I made a choice. If I could go back, knowing everything I know now, knowing the price I would pay, I would make the same choice again. Because some things matter more than career, more than comfort, more than fitting in. Integrity matters, truth matters, and the people we serve, the vulnerable, the silenced, The ones who need someone to stand up when everyone else looks away, they matter most of all. And you, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever experienced a situation where you had to choose between following orders and doing what was right? Leave your opinion here in the comments. I read them all, and I love knowing what you think. If this story impacted you in any way, subscribe to the channel to follow more real stories like this one, and do not forget to watch the next recommended video, because there are more intense stories waiting for you.